Welcome to this installment of a new distinguished lecture series that we've developed at Vanderbilt this year that is focused on the relationship between business and society and on key social and environmental issues in business today. We are very fortunate to have Bill Ginn, Chief Conservation Officer of the Nature Conservancy, with us tonight to talk about the important relationship between conservation and business. Let me start by offering a brief word of thanks to everyone who has been a part of bringing this event together tonight. First and foremost, the folks at the Nature Conservancy of Tennessee, all of the terrific people there who have done most of the heavy lifting on the event tonight, including Scott Davis, Elizabeth Lackey, and Trish Chris, and Wendy Bunton. I don't know if Wendy's with us tonight, but I know she wanted to be, even if she couldn't be because of her new, she's a new mom, so. Secondly, Vanderbilt's chapter of an organization called Net Impact, which is focused on exposing MBA school students to the reality that the purpose of business is about much more than maximizing profits for shareholders. And lastly, to the Vanderbilt Center for Business and Society, a new academic center of excellence focused on these topics that I'm involved with developing here at Vanderbilt. Our format tonight is as follows. Bill is going to spend the first 20 or 30 minutes or so talking and presenting. I'm then going to transition us into a kind of a Q&A session where I'll lead off to get the ball rolling with a few questions I have for Bill, and then I'll turn to all of you for your questions. And so we'll spend at least a half an hour. We'll have at least a half an hour or so to get into your questions for Bill. And just I'll say this again when we get there, but just as a procedural point, for those of you that are near the front of the room, you probably won't need a microphone to stand and tell us who you are and ask your question to Bill. For those of you that might be in the back of the room, there are two microphones set up, one here in the center and one over on the right side of the room, and you're welcome to use them if you need them to tell us who you are and ask Bill a question, okay? So I'm Jim Shore. I teach next door at the Owen School of Management, Vanderbilt's MBA program. Most of my work to date has been in an area that has come to be known as social enterprise, which involves the use of business models and market-driven approaches to address social and environmental issues or problems, sometimes called market failures. Microfinance, just as a point of relation, is which involves the provision of credit and loans to the poorest of the poor, and its leading proponents, the Grameen Bank and Muhammad Yunus, is perhaps the world's most prominent example of social enterprise today, and an example of social enterprise's ability to address entrenched problems more effectively, efficiently, and sustainably than traditional government and nonprofit approaches. So in reading Bill's book recently, I was thrilled to learn of his epiphanal moment as a young conservationist when he partnered with a local mill in Maine to recycle and repurpose sawmill waste as fertilizer and built a successful business that was recycling more than 1 million yards a year of waste annually and making a nice profit by the time he sold it several years later. I don't know if Bill thinks of himself as a social entrepreneur or of that business he started as a social enterprise, and if he doesn't, I'm going to do my best to convince him that he is one over dinner after the talk tonight. While Bill and I have just met today, I'm confident that he and I have shared in the realization that business and the environmental movement can no longer be at odds with each other as they have been for so long. Business people and environmentalists have come to see that the price of progress is a false dichotomy, and that when we refuse to be blinded by the conventional wisdom, we see that there are many opportunities for approaching conservation as partners in creating shared value. Bill comes to us tonight as a conservationist turned businessman turned conservationist who's using the power of business as a platform to make the world a better place. After a career working in this area of convergence, including the past 12 years with the Nature Conservancy, today Bill is the Nature Conservancy's Chief Conservation Officer and is a leading practitioner and thinker on the relationship between conservation and business. So with that as introduction, please join me in welcoming Bill Ginn to Vanderbilt and to Nashville.
Thank you. Appreciate it very much. Thank you very much. Is this on? Can you hear me? Great. Thanks for plugging my book. There'll be a spike in sales, I hope, next week. It was published by, one of those nonprofit academic presses, maybe not the most astute marketers, but they did send me on a book tour, which was great. Of course, it was a cheap book tour, only in New England where you have to drive, between garden clubs and bookstores. So, but it was, it was one of those ordeals, but they were very nice. They hired me a driver to drive me between all the book clubs and little bookstores across the Northeast. And we got to be really good friends because we traveled together for about 30 days. And I said, about 20 days into it, I am getting so tired of giving the same talk every day. And my driver looked at me and said, you think you're getting tired of giving it? I've had to listen to the darn thing for the last 20 days. The next morning, I woke up and I was so sick, and I said to my driver, remember you said you'd listen to my talk 20 times? And he said, yeah, well, I just don't think I can go on today. Do you think maybe you could, And he was a good guy, and he said, sure, why not? And he'd heard every question you can imagine, he got up, and he was like born again. It was unbelievable. He gave the most vibrant, exciting presentation in my name that I'd ever seen, and I sat in the back of the room, And then, the questions were all pretty straightforward, and then finally, though, someone in the back, some smart business school guy, I'm sure, raised his hand and asked this incredibly esoteric question about, carbon cycles and trees and markets and all that, and I could see his face kind of going like this, uh-oh, I'm about to be found. And then he brightened up and he said, well, actually, if you think about that and reason your way through that question, that's a very simple and easy question. Why, I'll tell you what, I think my driver in the back can answer that question. So Scott Davis, wherever you are, if I get any tough questions, you're going to be my driver tonight. So what a great pleasure to talk to an audience like this, and I'm really excited about the topic that you've chosen to make as this series to explore these interconnections between social enterprises and business, the environment, because I think that is really the most important space for all of us to contemplate and think about as we embrace the big challenges that we face as a society. Let me start first by just recounting some of those sobering challenges that we face and tell you how I think about solving them and some of the work of the Nature Conservancy in addressing these issues. These are big challenges. Let's first start with population. We're at about 6 billion. The very best case that population biologists can come up with is that we'll top out at 9 billion. And that's not very far away. The worst case is 11 or 12 billion. At 9 billion, we need 50% more food. That means, more agriculture, more use of the landscape. Where is that food going to come from? What are the compromises and challenges necessary in order to achieve that? Big implications for the environment, big implications for all of us. Now, this is not just something that's happening outside of the United States. It's happening here. In 1919, we had 100 million people in this country, 1919, within the lives of maybe a few of us here, but certainly your parents or grandparents. It's expected that in our lifetime, of probably everyone in this room, we'll hit 400 million. A 4x increase in the population of this country in roughly 100 years. These are big challenges. These are why many of the environmental and conservation issues we face, energy use, land use, are so pressing and so strong as we look forward to the future. Let's talk about water. Water is such an important thing. I was in Mexico 2 weeks ago working with our Mexico program in the Gulf of California. And the Gulf of California is where the Colorado River flows into the Pacific Ocean. And as I was telling somebody, maybe the TNC folks today, I have more water flowing over the end of my driveway after a rainstorm than comes out of the Colorado River today. You know, it's amazing how over-expropriated that water is. And this is not a familiar story. Something like 1.6 billion people in the world live in water-stressed regions. We use so much of the fresh water of this world. When you think about what is it going to be like to grow the food, grow the resources necessary in order to clothe and feed a population as big as what we're talking about. It has amazing consequences, and we're already at the edge in so many places in the world. So big challenges there. The oceans. The Pew Commission on the Oceans just released a report that said by 2050 we will have exploited 100% of all the fishery stocks in the ocean. Today, roughly a third of them are overexploited. So we're in a tipping point in terms of how we use the oceans for the future. That's got to be sobering, because 1.1 billion of those people on Earth, get their primary protein from the oceans. So what's a future for those people in which we are overexploiting the very source of food that is essential to their daily livelihood? I was at a signing in Indonesia, now 6 months ago, where the 6 governments who are in this Coral Triangle area, the richest place of biodiversity, got together. And it was billed as a conservation agreement that those countries were signing. But the real driving force and the subtext to that agreement was food security. Because there's 200 million people that use the food from those reefs, and how those fisheries, how those oceans are managed has everything to do with whether or not there will be economic and political stability in 50 years in that region. So those governments get it. They need to be very worried about the social, the governmental, the cultural impacts in their communities from all of this. So these are very big problems. They're very complex problems, and it's easy to be, frankly, quite discouraged about how we can solve these issues. But one thing is for sure, it's going to require new approaches. The Nature Conservancy has been tilting at this windmill for 60 years, and I can tell you we're not winning. We haven't turned the corner on any of these big issues, and those are sobering things for us because we think we're pretty good at the work that we do. But we recognize that we need new tools, we need new partnerships, we need new ways to approach this problem if we're going to solve these really amazing and complex issues. At the heart of it for me is the realization that we are not going to solve these problems unless we find ways to engage the business sector of this world. One little fact that always sticks out to me is that business spends in one day what all the governments of the world combined spend in 365 days. If we are unsuccessful in engaging business in the debate about the future of our world, we can never win. We must find ways to create partnerships across those big users, those big important players, and business is right at the top of the list. So success requires us, it's not an option, success requires us to find a way to work together to try to achieve the kind of world that we need and to build the right kind of future for the world. So let's talk about what some of the strategies, some of the issues and opportunities might be. Let's talk about forests for a moment. About 300 years ago, we had 6 billion hectares of forests on the world. Today we have roughly 3 billion, so 50% decrease in total forests. You might say, well, why? Was conservationists unsuccessful? Well, obviously we were unsuccessful, but the fundamental reason why we have so much fewer forests is that forests don't compete economically with other uses for that land. Growing trees is just not as attractive as agriculture. You can make more money selling your land for agriculture than you can growing trees over a period of time. So if we want to have more forests in the world, somehow we got to figure out how to make them more economically attractive. And that's a key challenge for all of us and an example of the challenges that we face here. So if you're a landowner who owns trees, today basically you have two sources of revenue. One is to cut the trees, and the other is to sell the land. Those are your two sources of revenue here. No one is paying you for the other services that that forest provides, the recreational attributes of that forest, climate attributes of that forest. What I call the sort of dirty little secret of climate change is that 15 to 20% of all the carbon that's going up in the atmosphere is coming from the destruction of forests. It's not coming from automobiles or coal-fired plants or inefficiencies in housing. It's coming from the loss of those forests. Something that I think we could all agree we should try to figure out how to solve. That's a good thing for society to solve. So imagine the importance of markets that actually began to economically reward someone for growing trees for other attributes of that forest besides cutting them for timber, besides for developing those. So if we could achieve that kind of idea coming out of the resolution of our climate issues, for example, that would be a very, very big win for us. Of course, the Nature Conservancy is already working in lots of ways to try to create value for other attributes of forests. Here in Tennessee, we've just completed with a great partnership with the state and many of you an enormous project in the Cumberlands to connect the Cumberlands. In fact, areas like this, almost 200,000 acres of land and connecting at least 300,000 acres of other properties adjacent there. Well, you get a big deal like that done, a big landscape impact done there, not because, the donors of the Nature Conservancy are so rich that they can go out and just buy that. You get that kind of work done because you create partnerships across the landscapes, and that's exactly what happened here. Timber investors who are interested in owning the income from trees, in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, who was interested in owning the biodiversity, if you will, of those landscapes, protecting those landscapes from conservation, partnering together to create an economic model where the Nature Conservancy provided capital for those conservation outcomes and investors provided capital for the working forest underneath those. That's a kind of partnership that allows us to expand our influence, to double or triple or quadruple the resources that we have, and to create value, another kind of value for timber investors by co-investing with them in an outcome that's important for society. So that's just an example of the kind of work that the Conservancy does to create value and the opportunities around forests. Let's talk a little bit about water. I happen to think no matter what you think about climate change, one thing is true, which is that water is a far scarcer commodity today and is going to have much more profound impacts in the next 20, 30, 40 years than climate change is going to have on us. Water is such an important ingredient for the future of civilization. About 150 years ago, New York City had this very simple idea, which was that they ought to acquire and invest in the sources of the water for the city of New York, and that's how they ended up buying huge swaths of land in the Catskills. Really interesting idea of connecting the generation of water with the users of water in an economic virtual system. Well, that's an idea that has been laying around for all these 150 years until the Nature Conservancy picked it up and said, gosh, maybe there's another way to think about this and another way to expand on this idea outside of places like New York City. Our first big experiment was in Quito, Ecuador, when we convinced the government of Quito to add a surcharge to the cost of their water system. And that surcharge then was deployed to protect the watersheds from which all the water comes for the city of Quito. So all of a sudden, the cost of water in Quito began to reflect the cost of protecting the source of the water, creating this virtual circle in which we connect the source of money and the need together in ways that allow that continued investment over a long period of time. We're on our 12th water fund now in Latin America. These are really big ideas. People are very interested in this as their cities grow, as the demand for water grows, making that connection between the users of water and the protecting of the water. The latest fund, the most recent fund that we've just launched is really interesting because the fund is not a government fund. It's a fund in partnership with the sugarcane growers in Colombia. Why? Sugarcane uses an enormous amount of water. And the sugarcane growers woke up one morning and said, oh my gosh, all those hillsides above our fields are all being cleared. The water regime is changing. Our future viability of our agricultural enterprise is all tied up in abundant water coming from those hills. We need to begin to think about as a business how we can make an investment to ensure that those areas are protected. So this is not government doing it. This is a business who says, oh, you know, I have a connection to that source. Well, that's powerful if we can begin to replicate that kind of work. Another example of how the marketplace can work. About now 12 years ago, San Antonio and Austin, there's some friends from Austin here, were sued by the Sierra Club. Why? Because they were drawing down the aquifer, known as the Edwards Aquifer, beneath the level of where the desert seeps, where the water spills out of that karst aquifer, and as you draw the water down, it dries up those areas. Well, why was that important? Because all those little seeps out there in the desert are where all the endangered species are. And so the Sierra Club sued on the basis of the Endangered Species Act and won a judgment against the cities. Now, they faced a number of choices as to how to solve this problem. You know, mandating, you know, alternate sprinklers on Tuesdays and low-flow toilets and all those things. But they were worried that that wasn't enough. So they set on a course of creating a whole new regime of water rights in which they awarded, through a very difficult and litigious process, the ownership of the water in the Edwards Aquifer. The first year that system went into effect, water use went down 12%. Why? Because everybody who owned water rights all of a sudden said, oh, this is worth $3,000 an acre foot. That's real money. I don't want to use it or waste it because I might be able to sell it to somebody else. On the other hand, someone who had to buy water all of a sudden said, well, gosh, maybe I don't need that much water. You know, maybe I should invest in some other technology. So the combination of those market forces began to change and evolve how we use water. That's so important today and such a huge opportunity for us because most water law in the United States is based on if you don't use it, the next guy down can. So you have no incentive not to use that water because if you don't use it, it just flows down the river and the next person can take it out of the water. So that's a wrong economic system that sends the very wrong incentives for how we might think about water. And it has, of course, huge implications for biodiversity because if all rivers begin to look like the Colorado River, you know, trickling out into the Gulf, there are huge ramifications for biodiversity, huge ramifications for fisheries, huge ramifications for people ultimately. So there's an interesting challenge. Let's talk about the oceans for a moment. I mentioned the dire state of our fisheries. Well, you know, the reality of the oceans are that we've not had a regulatory system that really has aligned and created the right kind of incentives to manage fish stocks across the world. And most common, of course, is the treatment of the oceans as a common, in which everybody owns something, and if I don't catch that fish, the guy in the boat behind me will catch that fish. So no incentive for you to steward or husband your resources because you could do a great job of that, but the next fisherman behind you could catch all the fish. So no incentive to invest long term. Well, we and lots of other people across the world are beginning to try to think about how we change that paradigm. The Nature Conservancy today, this is an amazing fact, is the largest owner of coastal fishing boats in California. You might say, wow, what are you doing? You we have been steadily buying fishing boats in California for 3 reasons. Number one, we wanted to reduce the level of effort for fishing, just try to get some boats out of the industry so that fish stocks could recover. Number two, we wanted to be part of the economic system. As an owner, we have certain rights and certain interests. And the fact that the Nature Conservancy, as a major owner of fishing, was able to sit in the regulatory process and advocate for more marine protected areas made a huge difference and gave courage to the National Marine Fisheries Service and NOAA to establish an additional 4.5 million acres worth of marine protected areas. We were part of the industry, a major player in the industry, making the case that investing in protected areas in order to spread the opportunity for fish stocks to recover made a huge, huge difference to the regulatory process. And the third thing, and maybe the most important thing, is that we wanted to begin to introduce new ways of thinking about fishing into the fishing area. And that took some real courage, because instead of drying up all those permits and saying, no, we're not going to fish any of that, the Nature Conservancy has turned around and started leasing those permits back out to fishermen, but with conditions. You must use the new latest technology. You must respect the Nature Conservancy's protected area boundaries. And so it becomes a bargain. It's been a wonderful experience for us, because we're working with the working community, trying to figure out how to do this better. We've given them an opportunity, sort of a little bit aside from the economic pressures of buying their boat or paying for it, to begin to experiment and explore new technologies. So it's been a win-win working in partnership with the industry in a very, very powerful way. It takes a lot of courage to make those kinds of investments and pioneer those new areas, and there's always plenty of risk of failure in thinking about this, but I'm convinced that it's going to take that kind of innovation in order for us to be a success. One other example, the Amazon. Incredibly important forest resource for lots of reasons, under enormous threat. 2 biggest threats really are conversion for soybean growth, and secondly for beef. Those are the things that are really driving the future of the Amazon. So how do you think about that problem? The largest buyer of soybeans is the Cargill Company. A great American brand, here. They came to us and they said, you know what, we're getting a lot of questions from our European buyers. They're kind of interested in the question of whether or not their buying soybeans from us is destroying the Amazon. And we have no idea. We just buy soybeans. How can you, the Nature Conservancy, help us try to understand what's happening, where those soybeans are coming from, whether the people who are growing those soybeans are in compliance with the forest code and the agricultural conversion codes in the Amazon? Well, that's powerful to have a major buyer, the major global buyer, begin to ask those questions and to look for partnerships as to how we think our way through, making sure that we as a company, because our customers want it, are actually delivering a product that we can feel proud of, that's sustainable for the future and isn't destroying the environment. Very similar thing is happening in the cattle industry, this time actually driven by Walmart. Everyone's favorite bad boy, at some level, in this world, because they're big. But Walmart actually has a very interesting sustainable practice here. Work that they're doing around labeling, really interesting pressure they're putting on their suppliers to engage here is really, really fascinating. One of those areas happens to be beef. They're one of the largest buyers of beef in the world to power their supermarkets. And the Amazon is a source of a big portion of that. They led an effort to work with their 3 main slaughterhouses. There are 5 big companies in the Amazon who process all the beef in the Amazon. 3 of them work for Walmart. They reached an agreement with all 3 of those slaughterhouses that they would no longer buy beef from properties which were known to be out of compliance with the forest code of Brazil. Well, that's huge. that's absolutely amazing to have one of the biggest corporations in the world using their muscle to try to shape the practices. Now, of course, just like Cargill, those 3 slaughter companies have no idea whether their growers are in compliance. There's a huge opportunity to try to help those companies figure out how to, whether or not they're in compliance, and an even bigger idea to think about how do we get those companies that are growing the product or raising the beef back out of the cold, so to speak, and back into compliance. So big opportunities, big problems to solve, but really great examples, I think, of corporations responding to their customers, thinking about their own footprint, and taking steps to change the world in really powerful ways, ways that, frankly, the Nature Conservancy could never, ever do on our own. Walmart is so much more powerful. The influence of Cargill is so much more powerful. And to have them partnering with us, thinking through these issues, engaging, is a huge, huge opportunity for us, for the environment, and I think for those corporations going forward. So these are all, I think, examples of this space between the environment, between business, between market-based incentives, around the question of how do we engage together with business. If we think forward 10 years from now, think of how powerful the world could be if there were truly incentives for people to continue to grow trees rather than to convert their land to agriculture. Think how powerful it would be if there really was a mandate around sustainable agriculture that was driven by market forces. Think how powerful it would be if markets really worked for water and people were incentivized for conserving water, not just for using it going forward. These are things that could really change the whole face of this world in a positive way, and it's the kind of thing that gives me hope for the future. It's thinking about investing in nature as opposed to de-investing in nature, and that is a huge and important, profound change for how we think about society. Now, these things are not going to come easy, and of course the Nature Conservancy is not going to throw away all the other things that we do. We're not going to have Yellowstones and Yosemites and places like that unless people care about old-fashioned conservation and protect these most important places. We need to continue to do that work. But the challenge for the future is not about the 10% that might be in national parks or protected areas. It's about the 90% that is this working landscape that's really going to determine what kind of quality of life we have, what kind of future we have as a society. I'm absolutely convinced the private sector is at the core of that work. And I personally think that the work that you business students are embarking upon is absolutely at the cutting edge. And we need more people who are interested in business, interested in finance, to begin to apply their dark arts on these problems and to really think through how to do this. So it's a great calling and a very exciting calling for all of you students here and all of you who are thinking about how you can use your position in business to explore these areas and figure out how we can contribute and change the world. In that sense, the idea of making a profit, is so important here and so misunderstood by many of my colleagues in the environmental world who think, oh, making a profit, that's a bad thing. No, it really is, at the heart of the question of how we incentivize people to make changes. There's 10% of people out there in the world that will do good things just because it's the right thing to do. But there's so many other people in this world who have day jobs, are trying to meet their credit card payments, trying to do the right thing, but they have the reality of their economic life. So how can we create the financial incentives that allow them to play, that allow them to participate in society and to make the right choices? We have to figure out how to engineer that because just altruism and good deeds is not enough in order to save the world. So thank you for listening to me. I hope that some of these stories have given you some ideas about areas of interest, and I'd be very happy to answer questions or hear your thoughts about this area. Jim, thank you.
Okay, so I have a few questions to get the ball rolling on this Q&A sort of part of the agenda tonight. And again, if you have questions, your time is coming soon. So write them down or commit them to memory or whatever you need to do, right? Bill, so one of the more remarkable and in my mind promising developments in the environmental movement in recent years has been the shift from an adversarial to collaborative relationships between nonprofits and business. As someone who has both witnessed and fostered that transformation, can you share some thoughts on how and why this has happened and the impact it's had on environmental progress?
Yeah, well, look, it's a big world, and you know, I can't say that all conservation groups have drunk my Kool-Aid. So it's simply not true that all conservationists believe that partnering with business is, you know, in such an important part of the future. Many of them still, you know, are stuck in, I think, old attitudes and old ideas about this. And frankly, I think, you know, we have to say that many businesses are also stuck in those adversarial roles. And haven't made the migration to realize that, you know, we need to solve these problems together, because it has everything to do with the questions of, you know, whether their business will prosper, will grow, and be viable, is to think about how to be sustainable here. So it's a big, complex world, and the world is by no means in a big, pluralistic, democratic society like we live in. Are all the forces aligned to make this a love story. But that doesn't mean that we can't have the courage to try to really engage and work hard in this space. And there's just so much opportunity for us to work together. And I think a lot of very interesting and powerful people are recognizing that that's the case. And so, you know, but it's an evolution. And it'll take, you know, a lot of good examples of how that's made a difference for us to win the day, I think. We talk a lot in my coursework here at Vanderbilt about the challenge of scale with in nonprofit organizations, scale with social enterprise, scaling to address problems at the level of scale, of their scale, right? Of growing and replicating approaches that are working in a small way, so that they can solve social and environmental problems at the level of the problem. Can you talk a bit about how this notion of scale manifests itself in conservation and how that relates to business? So we used to have a wonderful member of our national board who was an admiral from the South Pacific. And after he heard my talk, he said to me, "Bill, you know, here's my diagnosis of the problem. You live in a target-rich environment, and you don't have enough missiles." You know, and it's really true. You know, everywhere we turn, there are problems, there are issues, there are important things to solve. So just because it's important actually doesn't turn out to be a very limiting factor in setting your priorities. You have to think about, you know, is there an opportunity to leverage that example, to create new practices, to create a model that someone else can replicate, because that's the only way you really win, is to figure out how to accomplish that work. You know, you're not going to save the world 1 acre at a time. You know, the way you're going to save the world is by empowering lots of people to each go out and do their piece of that puzzle. And so the model for the Nature Conservancy, and I think people who look at this smartly, you know, is really focused on, you know, trying to figure out where are those places where we can get real traction, we can make a real difference today, where we can pioneer and innovate, you know, create change in powerful and important ways. That's the big opportunity, and that has everything to do with scale, replicability, leverage. Those have got to be key mantras in all of this, because the world is a big place, and it needs a lot of help, and we need to make a difference.
You talked a bit about connecting the Cumberlands and the degree to which that represents sort of a cross-sectoral collaboration of sorts. One trend in my mind that appears to be driving a lot of this is a growing convergence of activity among the public and private and nonprofit sectors, where there's a sort of a growing recognition today that more collaborative approaches to problem solving are needed versus rather than the more siloed sort of approaches of the past. Can you share some additional thoughts beyond connecting the Cumberlands and some examples of this sort of, how you were seeing this sort of convergence activity?
Yeah, well, first, it's a really interesting space because, nonprofits working with business, that immediately raises a flag. What's the conflict of interest here? Somebody's making a profit over, a nonprofit's work. So finding your way through this is very difficult. And let me just give you, one, additional example of how the Nature Conservancy thinks about this. A project that I worked on a couple of years ago, the Finch Prine Company, which was a big old paper mill in the Adirondacks in New York, owns 165,000 acres right in the dead center of the Adirondacks. So important from a conservation perspective. Family owned. The family woke up one morning and said, we're going to sell it. The whole thing. The mill, everything that we own. Well, if you think about this as a conservationist, you say, well, I just want to buy the land, right? And they say, no, we're selling the whole company. We're not interested in, the land piece. You might be interested in that, but we want to sell the whole company. So, if you're just in the conservation silo, you're dead. You don't have an alternative that's appropriate. So in the case of the Nature Conservancy, we went out and put together a business consortium. The Nature Conservancy, yes, we were interested in the land. There's a company called Brookfield that invests in hydro assets out of Canada. The Brofman family, they wanted hydro assets. Another company called Atlas Holdings that's interested in older mills that they can re-engineer and make profitable. We put together a consortium of those three investors. We were all aligned. We worked hard to figure out how to align ourselves. We wanted the land, they wanted the hydro, they wanted the mill, but we all had to work together because guess what? The hydro fed the power to the mill, our timberlands fed the furnish to the mill, so we were in it together and we had to work our way through how one would think about that kind of a business problem to create that kind of partnership. At the end of the day, $210 million purchase, we won. Our consortium bought those assets. That's a big, bold, example of trying to figure out how to partner with private sector. But it goes to the heart of the question of scale. Unless we're willing to figure out how to create those partnerships and find somebody else, who wants the mill, who wants those assets, and figure out, we're not going to be successful. So that's the space that, for me, is so exciting as we think forward, is to have the courage to engage in those conversations and try to figure it out. We don't always win. I've worked on 5 bankruptcies. I've lost 3 of them, and I've won 2 for the Nature Conservancy. You don't always win. You don't always get what you want. That's reality. But if you're willing to work in that space, every once in a while you get an extraordinary outcome that changes your world and changes the world of your partners.
Okay, now it's time for your questions, and we've already got one right here in the front, which is great. Let me just reiterate, if you would stand and tell us who you are as you're asking your question, that would be terrific, and if you need the use of a microphone, there are 2 right here, okay? Thanks.
wish I could believe that because I feel like government is right there. And so are you hoping to, with business and the successes, then be able to influence business?
Sure.
And when I say business, you know, to me, they're lumped in with oil, gas, coal. You know, even though those are separate, they're also together in my mind. Yeah. And so, can you speak to that? And you know, because and I'm talking county, state, federal, and
Well, of course, you know, look, these problems are not simple, and as I said, there's no silver bullet here. You know, business isn't going to solve all the problems. You know, we need that partnership, and certainly government is a huge part of that conversation. So, I don't mean in any way to minimize it. I just really mean to elevate and raise to everyone's attention how important it is adding business to that equation is, because so often they're left out or they're the objects of rather than a partner in trying to figure out and solve these problems, which is really what, you know, ultimately we need to do. So, yes, government has a huge, powerful role. Leadership's going to come from all different, you know, segments here. Sometimes it comes from nonprofits, sometimes it comes from government. And increasingly, I think, frankly, it's coming from business. And that's something that gives me a lot of courage and hope. You know, as they sit at the table, they can get some things done that are pretty amazing and pretty powerful. So it's less about diminishing the role of government and more about recognizing how important business is to have at the table. Please.
I'm a bad name. Great save in the Adirondacks.
Thanks.
Speak up.
Okay, it was great save in the Adirondacks. Here's my question. If, let's say, the Canadian industry wanted to sell their part, how does that work when the three entities come together? Was the contract binding for X amount of years, or one of the two wanted to sell their portion, then the other two pitch in? Or how does that work when you negotiate?
Yes, so in the case of the hydro, I can't actually answer the question of what's the business relationship, but I know they have a long-term business relationship between the mill and the hydro. I just, you know, wasn't involved in the negotiation of that. I can speak to the Nature Conservancy's portion of it. We entered into a 30-year agreement to provide a certain amount of furnish to the mill. And so we have what's called a fiber supply agreement, that fiber has to be delivered to the mill under the terms of that agreement. We negotiated that agreement, though, with an eye to what it is that we wanted to finally accomplish at the mill. And critical to that was the notion that ultimately our scientists told us that about 40% of the property really should become part of the Adirondack Forest Preserve and be part of the Forever Wild piece. But that about 60% of it was our biodiversity objectives could be fully accomplished with a sustainably managed working forest. So our fiber supply agreement basically falls on the fiber from that 60%. Now, from the Nature Conservancy's perspective, you know, the reality is we have to pay for all this. So our objective when we do these transactions is to figure out, you know, the next day after we make them happen, how it is that we actually get out of the fact that we spent $110 million of the Nature Conservancy's treasury in this work. And so therein also lies another business story, really a government business partnership, because that 90,000 acres that our scientists said, no, that's fine, that can be managed sustainably. The first thing that we did was to go out to the marketplace and say, who wants to buy that property in the private sector and manage it under a conservation easement placed over that property by the Nature Conservancy? The high bidder, interesting for us, the second largest Danish pension fund. Not an investor from the United States. That's how global this world place, you know, really is. So ATP, a Danish pension fund, you know, is our partner now and has taken over our position managing the timberlands under a conservation easement designed by the Nature Conservancy to ensure that our biodiversity values are met. We're in the process of exchanging that easement with the state of New York, who's going to buy that easement from us, contributing to the payment of that. So we got money from the pension fund. We're selling an easement on that land to the state. And that final piece, you know, the lands that are too important to be anything but added to the Adirondacks area, we have a long-term contract with the state. So altogether, all those moving pieces will eventually, when it all closes, cover our $110 million and then some for the cost of our capital being deployed there. So I hope we walk away from that transaction having paid for it in partnership with business, with government, and with our donors to create that virtuous circle that allowed us to accomplish that great goal. We expect to leave, you know, probably something like $17 or $18 million in the ground. You know, that's the friction for us getting all that conservation done and brokering, if you will, all of these solutions. You know, that's 17 or 18% of the project, you know, of what we paid for the project, half of that for the entire deal. I think that's a pretty good, you know, leverage for our investment of our donors' capital. And we have to think about that because our donors' capital is the most precious, most valuable source of capital we have. It's our equity. It has the highest rate of return attached to it. And we need to spend that so well. It is like gold for us. So we need to think about how to leverage that again and again and again in order to get impacts at the scale that Jim talked about.
Please. I'm sorry, at the microphone.
Hi, I'm Evie Jackson, and
Oh, it doesn't appear to be on, Evie.
my name is Evie Jackson.
Hey, Evie.
My question is about the role of the consumer. Probably about 18 months ago, something caught my attention, and it was the fact that due to some change in regulation, I think levels of selenium and MAF, is the science wrong, here in Tennessee, were going to be dangerous enough to be toxic to mallard ducks. So as a kid, I raised a duck one time, and I thought, you know, a duck has a lot of the same parts that I do. If a duck is going to be impacted, might I be impacted? So that has kind of sparked a journey to explore water and what's in our water. But my question is the kind of rise in education and awareness among consumers driving structural changes in business, or is it just driving greenwashing type efforts?
Well, I mean, in all honesty, you'd have to say probably both. You know, there are companies who, you know, try to skate by on these questions, you know, with a good ad campaign. But I think there are a lot of companies that are taking these challenges, you know, very seriously and hard. But, you know, you are, you know, a member of the public, but you're a customer. That's great power. You have extraordinary power because, you know, what drives business is customers. And, you know, how we vote with our pocketbook is so powerful in sending, you know, the right kinds of messages to business. So being, you know, smart and aware of the challenges and issues and thinking about how you vote with your dollars is very, very powerful, and we shouldn't forget that as part of the equation. That's what's driving Cargill, not, unfortunately, U.S. citizens saying we're worried about the Amazon, but European citizens saying we're really worried about the Amazon, and we want to know, Cargill, you know, what are you doing to make sure that when we buy your soy products, we're not destroying the Amazon? Well, that's amazingly powerful to think about. But, you know, here's another example of a really interesting business example where businesses are making very conscious environmental choices in order to win. There's one of the largest mining companies in the world is a company called Rio Tinto. They own some of the biggest nickel and other mines all across the world. They've recently adopted a new set of corporate principles that say that all of their mining operations must have a net positive impact on biodiversity, a net positive impact on biodiversity. And you say, well, why would a mining company want to commit themselves to those kinds of standards? Well, a couple of reasons why. Number one, the company woke up one morning and realized that because of poor environmental practices in the past, their shareholders were being devastated by reoccurring environmental charges that 30 years ago somebody didn't pay attention to, and now they have to spend millions of dollars to remediate. A great American company, the Grace Company, brought to its knees in bankruptcy because of the Libby mine, a community with 150 people in it, where they didn't do the right job around asbestos. Destroyed, really, as a company. So smart companies are thinking about their environmental footprint because they're worried about the costs associated with not paying attention to the environment. But it's more than that. The company is also thinking and leaning forward and saying, how do we win in the global marketplace? Mines are tough, ugly business, and they're out there competing with all kinds of other people for, mines in Mongolia and mines in, in Africa. And so, they've decided that one way that they can win against low-cost providers is by being the best environmental steward and having the best environmental track record going forward. So it's a business strategy for them to win, in a global marketplace where they're competing against all kinds of other people, and they're betting big time that governments in the world are going to say, you know what, we don't really want to have our place screwed up. We want to have somebody who we know has a good environmental track record, and that will give them a premium in the marketplace that will make them a better company, a more profitable company because of their commitment to the environment. So all these forces are in play, really interesting, business thinking here that's, all motivated around this question of trying to understand who their customers are, what their motivations are, and a lot of them are recognizing that the environment has a big piece here, and that has to play out in powerful ways. Oh, yeah.
But I was going to ask you one question after her question. Your answer was so interesting. My first job in television news was in Butte, Montana, which is within 50 miles of two EPA Superfund sites. And I haven't been back there to see what the copper mining company had done to clean that place up. But I know they built a golf course on top of one of the slag heaps.
Right.
My question was, on the hydroelectric portion of the project you talked about before this last question, did you have to build a plant, or was
No.
there one? Because I know
These were all run-of-the-river. This is Hudson River, all old-time, hydro assets that were part of that. So we were not engaged in the construction piece of this.
Thank God for that. That wouldn't take it.
Yeah, no, but this is a very interesting question here because as we think our way forward, I think all many of us coming from conservation, our knee-jerk reaction is renewable resources are we need more of them, but it gets complex when you start talking about rivers. Let me just give you another example of the kind of challenges that we face. If you were to ask the Nature Conservancy of California what the biggest threat to the Mojave Desert is 3 years ago, they would have said all-terrain vehicles, screwing up this very fragile soil. Today, in California, there's 1.6 million acres worth of BLM applications to build solar concentrators in the Mojave Desert to send renewable power to Los Angeles. So in 3 years, the whole game changed. Our preconceptions of what the threat was totally changed, around, a good policy, one might say, renewable resources, increasing in California. But, on the other hand, that plays out someplace on the landscape, in a powerful way. So we have to be rigorous about our thinking about these issues, and we have to recognize that, no progress comes without some trade-offs here. Now, maybe that's a good trade-off. Maybe that's the right trade-off to make. If they're in the right places, the Mojave's a big place, maybe we can manage that to make sure that none of that stuff gets built in places that are really important for biodiversity. But it's an example of the new world that we live in which the complexities are there, and they defy, good guy, bad guy kind of conversations. And that's what's so interesting about, the partnership with business is we can move beyond that good guy, bad guy conversation and begin to really talk about the forces that, and the issues that we really need to work on.
Has that become more difficult as the economy has worsened for businesses in the last couple of years?
Well, it's a good news, bad news story. I mean, the good news from the environment is maybe things have slowed down a little bit. We have a little bit more time to be reflectful about what it is that we're trying to accomplish together. So the threats maybe in a lot of places we work are not as great. In the panhandle of Florida, it's a whole different ball game than it was, a year or two ago. So yes and no. Certainly everyone is stressed. We're a lot poorer. Businesses are a lot poorer. It's a reset button.
Greer.
Thank you for being here, Bill. I'm Greer Tidwell with Bridgestone Tire Company. Actually make something for a living. Although my kids don't really believe that anymore. They know all I do is sit on a conference call and go to meetings. One, I want to applaud you for making new missiles in a target-rich environment.
Thanks.
What you did on that Rondax. It was really neat stuff. One of the things I've been involved in a little bit is focusing on getting kids outside so that they see the outdoors as not something to be scared of. And in particular, look at kids who are in urban setting, folks from minority backgrounds, minority cultures. What's the Nature Conservancy doing to sort of target partnering within that community, in particular within that business community?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, the reality is, if you look at the conservation movement, I'll tell you a story. I was in California at the Land Trust Alliance meeting, the meeting of the whole tribe, all together, 3,000 people. And this wonderful black woman got up and looked around the stage of all those conservationists and said, you know what? This is probably the whitest place in all of California today. Well, that is a stunning indictment of the conservation movement. So we have a real challenge here to think about, what conservation means to people of color, to communities, to places that are economically disadvantaged, and to figure out how we, deal with those kinds of challenges and issues. It doesn't go directly to the question, though, of, how do we create values? And, as a parent, I'm really worried about that issue. And, the short answer is, the Nature Conservancy is certainly not doing enough, to think about how we build that new constituency for the future of conservation. And there are lots of reasons, but, we all know that, most kids think it's a lot scarier out there in the environment than kids 30 years ago, and that has huge, implications for us going forward. So thinking about how, we make our work relevant to, what is the emerging color of this nation, the emerging language of this nation, is a very important job for the conservation movement. We don't have it. We haven't really dealt with that issue in the way that it needs to be dealt with.
Dan.
My name is Dan Surface. I consult with nonprofits to help them become more sustainable with earned income and social enterprise.
Great.
My question for you is, we talked about the business sector and possibly incentivizing them to change the way they do business, but I'd like to hear your opinion on how we can incentivize the nonprofit sector in changing the way they do business in order to become more innovative and make a larger social and environmental impact.
It's a really good question, and I think about it a lot because here I'm head of the conservation side of a huge organization by any standard that could become mired in bureaucracy and lethargic in its mission and purpose. So I think a whole lot about the question of how do we incentivize our staff to take risks, how we do that in an envelope that makes sense for the organization, that controls our risks, and all those good things. I think this is one case where the economic environment that we're in might provide a forcing mechanism for a lot of nonprofits to look very hard at themselves and to think much more strategically about how they work together and partner. And that's a good thing, I think. Nothing like, as Tom Friedman and others said, a good crisis to force ourselves to confront our own business internally and to make tough choices about what we do. It's painful for organizations like ours and many nonprofits who never really had a bad time and never really had to put their programs and ideas under the microscope of excellence and ask themselves whether or not it's the most important thing, that they're doing. So I think it's a big challenge, but I think this economy, in an odd sort of way, has given a lot of us the courage to face our own demons and make tough choices about our priorities and where we invest. And I know in the nonprofit environmental space, a lot of consolidation is happening. A lot of land trusts are saying, well, I guess we can't just protect our community. Maybe we got to band together with, other people and think about our business in a more efficient, regional kind of model. So it's not a very satisfactory answer, other than to say, sometimes you need an outside stimulus in order to create the mode of change that allows for the honest conversation. And for a lot of nonprofits, this last year has been that outside stimulus that's forcing them to think about their mission in a different way.
Thank you. One quick follow-up question. Have you had a conversation or intend to have a conversation with Obama's Office of Social Innovation in regard to that question?
I don't know him, sorry. So I can't say that I am. Now, maybe somebody in the Nature Conservancy is having that conversation. I hope so, for my sake, but I don't know the answer to that. Yep.
All right, you, sir, are next, but I want at least one question from one of these bright young Vanderbilt students before we get out of here tonight. Too many old folks asking questions. Where's no offense, not you.
Family has controlling stock in Vulcan Materials, which is on the New York Stock Exchange, a large mining organization, and he is directly sponsoring many of those same bills on the state level, which will lessen the legislative protection of our streams and rivers. If you'll read that article, it'll give you a broad outline, but it'll name the name. Also, I've over the last few years tried to work with a large food service company here in Nashville to lessen their, let's say, their packaging from Cisco food, purchasing or asking them to sell products that are less crap around them, plastics and cardboard. Also, to recycle their plastic bottles on entertainment locations and restaurants to resell their cardboard. And they talk a good game, but where I'm losing them is actually putting it into work. And you're talking Nature Conservancy, Cargill, and Walmart. I'm talking about a large food service organization with several restaurants and other things. How do you just kick them over the edge and hey, okay, and show them that it's worthwhile for their business to do that?
Well, I mean, it's a journey, of course, and I can't speak to the specifics of what motivates any of those companies, but it is a conversation that often takes a long time. The practical, one of the challenges for us is not just to say, you ought to do this because it's good. We have to figure out how to make it possible for them to actually do it. What does it really take, to make it possible for a company like that to, what is the infrastructure? This is actually one of the, I think one of the reasons I love being an entrepreneur in the solid waste space was that there was so much opportunity for innovation, so much opportunity to make it possible for people to do good work. So the whole infrastructure, if you will, that I grew up in my company to provide services to company, it was an extraordinary opportunity for me personally, but it also, created a service to solve a problem. And a lot of the challenges that businesses face are because, nobody has really, been willing to step up and begin to, as an entrepreneur, try to work in that space and solve the business problems, the practical business problems that they face, whether that's the design of the equipment to make it possible to recycle, or whether it's the services necessary to make that possible. So that's a really interesting space as for entrepreneurs, is to figure out how do we provide that support so it's not just a conversation about, you ought to do this because it's good for the planet, but more about, let me tell you about this really interesting company who's got just the product that you need in order for you to implement, the recycling program that I'm talking to you about. That's a journey, that's a great opportunity for, every one of the people in this room who wants to be an entrepreneur, is to tackle a problem and figure out how to solve it and make it really work, and to reduce the friction, in the system so that somebody can, easily make that happen. That's a big, big opportunity.
All right, we got some students with their hands in the air. Darcy.
Hi, I'm Darcy. I'm a student at the business school next door. My question is, I think a lot of us see the behavior change as a challenge here in the States, but when you look at the rest of the world, we're a lot farther on that sort of conservancy curve than other countries in the world. And I'm curious if you have worked with any businesses in China or have a relationship with any Chinese businesses, or what that looks like there, because it's potentially an area of greater concern than what's happening here in the States.
It's a great question. We have actually a huge China program. It's one of our biggest international programs, is our work in China, and the evolution in China is just astonishing. They learn so fast, and they're engaging so quickly in addressing these issues. It's really quite remarkable. 10 years ago, I went to the first meeting of our Asia Pacific Council that was sponsored by Hank Paulson, who was our volunteer board chair, and also the chair of Goldman Sachs. And most of the people that went to that meeting had not one clue what the heck we were talking about. These were really important business people in Asia. Fast forward to today, it's extraordinary, the difference in knowledge about these issues, the engagement. I think the Olympics had something to do with that, emerging consciousness, because, a bright light was shown, if you will. But the Chinese government is also, very interested in this issue. I think they get profoundly that, environmental and quality of life issues is a huge potential challenge for their whole system. As middle class citizens arise, they're less comfortable with air pollution. They're more interested in the quality of life for their kids, and they realize that they actually have a choice about those matters. And that's happening in China so fast, it's really unbelievable, the speed in which those changes are coming. So, yeah, you can say that, they have a long way to go, and they really do have a long way to go, but they're catching up fast, and the conversation and dialogue is, really, really powerful in China right now about conservation and environmental issues. Yeah, a lot of it's, 60s and 70s issues for us, straight pipes into rivers, people, being totally insulted and inundated, not the kind of subtle selenium issues that we face in this country, but that's evolving incredibly fast. So they may be behind, but they're serious, I think, about doing something about this, and that gives me hope. It's one of the great things about information technology is, the flow of information is so much faster, so much more powerful today that people are, I think, all over the world are learning faster. And that, gives me great, great hope that people will move through the curve a lot faster than we've moved through that curve and come out on the other side with a lot better values.
All right, I think we may have time for maybe one or two more questions. You've been waiting patiently.
Hey, Tom.
I wonder if there are lessons from your work in the private sector that might be adaptable to the public sector. Conservancy, the private sector, applicable. We tend to think of the government as our friend in conservation, and in this instance, frankly, we're working against it.
Yeah, well, it's a really, it's a good and, and powerful question. And I'm not sure I really have an answer to it, other than to say that, we are, just as we're consumers for business, we're consumers of government services, and, we have to articulate the case better. We have to, if we want to see change, what's the case for change? And how do we, lay that out in a powerful way? How do we, these are no small things, right? I mean, this is a big change. So to tackle an issue like that, it takes, a real campaign, a real old-fashioned focused effort to raise awareness, to create political leverage, to gain the trust and respect of, key partners, and to, drive for, for solutions that make sense. It's old-fashioned, tough politics, I guess, at one level, and we have to not forget those skills. We have to be willing to, to work and work hard to make that kind of change happen. So that's not a very grand answer, and I don't think there's any silver bullet, but if that's an important thing, and we've identified it as one of the most important things that we could do, how do we win? What are the things that, 5 years from now, we have a different system? How do we build a campaign that actually changes that? Who are the people that leverage that? Who are the leaders in that movement that, could begin to exert change in that system? Who are they? How do we find them? How do we engage them in the work that we want? It's tough, but, it's the work of democracy is really what it is. And, we need to remember that that's who we are as a people, and drive for those kinds of changes. It's being good citizens, and that's kind of a old-fashioned concept in many communities these days, with so many people not really participating in government. It allows big sections of government to just go on without anybody ever even looking at them, and wondering what they're actually doing for the people. So that's, a civic lesson that we need to really, teach our kids and be engaged in ourselves.
Is there anyone in the room who's dying to ask a question that hasn't been able to so far? All right. One more, and then we've got to feed Bill Ginn tonight.
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting space to be thinking about. On one hand, ecotourism represents a market for nature, right? It's a reason to protect your nature because people won't come there if you screw it up, and so trying to raise that brand awareness and to try to build that. There are a few countries on Earth here that actually have done a really, really good job of that. Costa Rica is an example of a place that's basically branded themselves around nature and does an extraordinary, business, largely not on anything other than the fact that 27% of Costa Rica is in national parks, and it's a beautiful place that they take care of. So they're being rewarded in the marketplace for doing, good work. So looking for ways that tourism can be a positive force, is a big opportunity for the conservation movement. On the other hand, tourism, creates Cancuns, and places that, consume their children, so to speak, and destroy the environment in which they work in. And so, it's like any force, I guess, it has its good side, and it can be a powerful ingredient in the future. And on the other hand, it represents, real serious challenges of people loving to death the very thing that, they set out to enjoy. So, we work with a lot of governments all across the world trying to make the economic case for parks, for example. And a lot of that is built around the question of, tourism and tourism dollars. It actually proves to be quite a powerful argument for companies, for countries who are thinking about the future. And so that's an example of, valuing nature. Can we make that work? There are some good examples. There are some bad examples. We just have to kind of figure out how we make more good examples, in the future.
Okay, so with that said, I'm going to wrap this up and leave you with a thought. Hopefully, for those of you that remain or came in here skeptical and remain skeptical, perhaps with good reason, about the opportunity to leverage business as a mechanism for positive environmental impact, I will say this. I like to think I don't look this old, but I've actually been working in this sort of realm for 15 or 20 years now, and I have seen two things happen over that period of time. One is that business is reconnecting with the idea that it has a much broader purpose than simply maximizing profits for shareholders. Business is increasingly these days driven around maximizing value for a broader set of constituencies, of stakeholders. And secondly, as business has done that, the experience has largely been that it is good for all parties. It's good for business. It's good for the shareholders. It's good for the stakeholders when business does take a broader perspective about its role and responsibilities in the world. So I think that is something we're in a point of evolution at this time, and I think that's something that is evolving. But nonetheless, I think it is definitely a trend that is worth taking note of and worth being somewhat encouraged about. So with that said, I have two thank yous to wrap this up tonight. One is a thank you to all of you for being a part of this. Thanks for taking a piece of your day out and spending this evening with us, and all of your great questions. And lastly, thank you to Bill. Thank you for getting down here from Maine and spending your time with us. A pleasure. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.